Sometimes, life presents us with moments that blur the lines of expectation, leaving us questioning everything we thought we knew. The day my son's best friend showed up at my door started as an ordinary Saturday, but it quickly became anything but. What began as a simple act of hospitality turned into an encounter that stirred emotions I didn't even realize I had. This is a story about connection, desire, and the unexpected paths life takes us on. Make sure you don't miss a moment. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for more captivating stories like this one. Now, let me tell you how it all unfolded. The sun hung low in the sky, bathing the living room in a golden haze as the soft hum of the evening news played in the background. I stood at the kitchen counter, idly sipping a glass of water, savoring the rare stillness of the house. My son, Ethan, was off on a camping trip with his college friends, leaving behind a quiet I wasn't used to. The silence was almost too still, the kind that makes you feel like something is about to happen. And then, as if on cue, the doorbell rang. I frowned, surprised. I wasn't expecting anyone. Setting my glass down, I headed for the door, wondering who it could be. When I opened it, I was greeted by a familiar face. Sebastian, Ethan's best friend. Sebastian stood on the porch, his tall frame backlit by the fading sunlight. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as though he'd been in a rush, and his warm brown eyes held a flicker of hesitation. Over his shoulder, a small backpack hung loosely, the strap clutched in his hand. "Mr. Walker," he began, his voice softer than I remembered. "I hope I'm not intruding. I had some car trouble and couldn't make it to the campsite. Ethan said I could always crash here if I needed to. Is that okay?" For a moment, I was caught off guard, not just by his sudden appearance, but by the subtle shift in his demeanor. Sebastian had always been confident, charming, the kind of guy who lit up a room, but now he seemed almost vulnerable, his usual bravado replaced by something quieter. "Of course, Sebastian," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "You're always welcome here." He smiled, but there was something about it that felt different, smaller, almost shy. As he walked past me, I caught the faint scent of his cologne, something woodsy and clean that lingered in the air longer than it should have. Once inside, he set his bag down near the couch and turned to me. "Thanks for this. I didn't know where else to go, and I didn't want to ruin Ethan's trip by calling him." "You don't have to explain," I said, waving off his concern. "You know this place is like a second home for you. Have you eaten? I can heat up some leftovers if you're hungry." "That would be great," he said, his eyes softening as he glanced around the familiar space. "It's been a long day." As I moved to the kitchen, I couldn't help but notice the way Sebastian seemed to fill the room, his presence making the house feel less empty. There was an energy about him, something magnetic I hadn't quite noticed before. Or perhaps I had, but I'd buried the thought as quickly as it had surfaced. We talked while I reheated dinner. Our conversation easy, but laced with an undercurrent of something unspoken. He told me about his plans for the summer, his struggles with classes, and his dreams of traveling after graduation. I found myself drawn to his voice, the way it deepened when he spoke about things he was passionate about. As the evening stretched on, I became acutely aware of how comfortable the atmosphere had become. Too comfortable, perhaps. There was a moment when our eyes met across the kitchen, the kind of moment that hangs in the air, heavy with possibilities. I quickly broke the gaze, turning my attention back to the food, but my heart was pounding in a way I couldn't quite explain. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Sebastian leaned back on the couch, his posture relaxed as he talked about the camping trip he'd missed. I sat across from him, but the space between us felt charged. At one point, he paused mid-sentence, his eyes searching mine as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "Thanks for letting me stay," he said finally, his voice low. "I mean it." "You don't have to thank me," I replied, my own voice quieter than I intended. "Your family." He smiled again, that same small, hesitant smile, and for the briefest moment, I wondered if he was about to close the distance between us. The thought startled me, and I stood abruptly, excusing myself to grab some blankets for the couch. When I returned, he was still sitting there, his expression unreadable. I handed him the blankets, and as our fingers brushed, I felt a jolt of electricity that left me wondering if he'd felt it too. As I headed upstairs to my room, my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What was this feeling stirring inside me? Was it just the loneliness of the empty house? Or was it something deeper, something I wasn't ready to confront? I closed my bedroom door, leaning against it as I exhaled slowly. Downstairs, I could hear the faint sound of Sebastian settling in for the night. It was just one night, I told myself, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the possibility that everything had changed. The morning came with soft sunlight streaming through the windows, painting the walls in hues of gold. I woke up earlier than usual, my mind still restless from the night before. Memories of Sebastian's presence downstairs lingered, the subtle tension from our brief interactions replaying in my head. I took my time getting dressed, trying to shake off the inexplicable feeling in my chest. When I finally stepped downstairs, Sebastian was already in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee, wearing a t-shirt that hugged his frame in a way that made me look away almost instantly. "Morning," he said, his voice still raspy from sleep. "Morning," I replied, moving toward the fridge to grab some eggs. "You're up early." "Couldn't really sleep," he admitted, leaning against the counter. "Guess I'm not used to the quiet here without Ethan around." I nodded, focusing on cracking the eggs into a pan. "Well, I hope the couch wasn't too uncomfortable." "It was fine," he said with a small smile. "Better than the back seat of my car, that's for sure." We fell into an easy rhythm as I cooked breakfast, the silence between us no longer as heavy as it had been the night before. He offered to set the table, and soon we were sitting across from each other, sharing a meal like we had done so many times before. But this time, something was different. The way his gaze lingered a moment too long on mine, the way his laughter came softer when I made a joke. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I couldn't ignore it, no matter how much I tried. After breakfast, Sebastian offered to help with the dishes. As we stood side by side at the sink, I found myself hyper-aware of how close we were. His arm brushed against mine at one point, and I felt my breath hitch, the small contact sending a ripple through me that I couldn't explain. "You seem distracted," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes were sharp. "You just seem quieter than usual. Everything okay?" I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. How could I explain what was going through my mind when I didn't fully understand it myself? "I'm fine," I said finally, turning back to the dishes. "Just thinking about work stuff." Sebastian didn't press further, but I could feel his eyes on me, studying me in a way that made my pulse quicken. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the tension between us remained, a quiet undercurrent that neither of us addressed. It wasn't until later that evening, when we were both sitting in the living room, that it finally came to a head. We'd been watching a movie, something light-hearted that Ethan had left behind, but I wasn't paying attention. My thoughts kept drifting, and I could feel Sebastian's presence beside me like a weight. During a quiet moment in the film, he spoke. "Mr. Walker, can I ask you something?" I turned to him, startled by the seriousness in his tone. "Of course. Do you ever feel like you're holding yourself back from something, like there's something you want but you're too scared to go after it? The question hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Was he talking about himself? Or was this about me? I think everyone feels that way at some point, I said carefully, my voice quieter than I intended. Why do you ask? He looked down, his fingers tracing the edge of his jeans. I don't know. I've just been thinking about it a lot lately. The room felt impossibly still, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. I wanted to say something, to ask him what he really meant, but I couldn't find the courage. Before I could respond, he stood up abruptly. I should probably head to bed. It's been a long day. I nodded, watching as he walked toward the stairs. But just before he disappeared, he paused, turning back to look at me. "Good night, Mr. Walker," he said softly, his eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary. "Good night, Sebastian," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As he disappeared up the stairs, I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest. His words echoed in my mind, along with the look in his eyes. Was it possible that he felt the same pull I did? Or was I imagining it, projecting my own confusion onto him? I didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain. Whatever was happening between us, it wasn't something I could ignore. The next morning, I woke up with a restless energy I couldn't shake. The questions from the night before lingered in my mind like a fog, thick and unrelenting. What had Sebastian meant with his question? Was it a passing thought, or had he been trying to tell me something? I tried to push the thoughts aside as I headed downstairs, but as soon as I saw him sitting at the dining table, sipping coffee, and scrolling through his phone, the tension came rushing back. He looked up and smiled, the same easy, familiar smile I'd seen 100 times before. But now, it felt different. Or maybe I was the one who'd changed. "Morning, Mr. Walker," he said, setting his phone down. "Good morning," I replied, forcing a casual tone. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," he said with a small laugh. "Thanks for letting me stay. I'll probably head out later today once I figure out what to do about my car." I nodded, a part of me relieved at the idea of regaining some sense of normalcy. But another part wasn't ready for him to leave. "Let me know if you need help with anything," I offered, heading into the kitchen to make myself some coffee. The morning passed uneventfully, though the air between us still felt charged. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I suggested we take a walk to clear our heads. There was a park not far from the house, a quiet place where I often went when I needed to think. Sebastian agreed, and soon we were walking side by side down the tree-lined path, the sun filtering through the leaves in golden streams. At first we talked about simple things, his classes, his plans for the summer, the trip he'd missed. But as we walked, the conversation began to shift. "Can I ask you something?" he said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence. "Of course," I replied, glancing over at him. "Have you ever felt like your life didn't quite turn out the way you thought it would?" The question caught me off guard, but it wasn't unfamiliar. I'd asked myself that same question many times before. "Yeah," I said after a moment. "I think everyone feels that way at some point. Life has a funny way of surprising you." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground in front of him. "I don't know. Lately, I've been feeling like I've been living my life the way everyone else expects me to. But it's not really what I want." I stopped walking, turning to face him. "What do you want, Sebastian?" He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that took my breath away. For a moment, I thought he might actually say it, might finally give voice to whatever had been lingering between us. But instead, he just shook his head, a rueful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I'm still trying to figure that out." We continued our walk in silence, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. When we got back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, that we were teetering on the edge of something neither of us fully understood. That evening, we sat in the living room again, this time with a glass of wine in hand. Sebastian had found an old bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion, and I decided this moment qualified. As the night wore on, the wine loosened our tongues, and the conversation became more personal. He told me about his fears, his dreams, and the pressure he felt to live up to everyone else's expectations. "I guess I just feel stuck," he admitted, his voice low. "Like I'm supposed to have everything figured out by now, but I don't." "You're young," I said, leaning back in my chair. "No one has it all figured out at your age. Hell, I'm twice your age, and I'm still trying to figure things out." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. "Do you really believe that? Or are you just saying it to make me feel better?" "I believe it," I said firmly. The room fell quiet, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, without warning, Sebastian leaned forward, his gaze locked on mine. "I think I know what I want," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could respond, he stood abruptly, his movements almost frantic as he muttered something about needing air. I watched as he walked out the back door, leaving me alone with a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he'd been. Whatever was happening between us, it was coming to a head, and I wasn't sure either of us was ready for what came next. The back door was still slightly ajar when I finally got up from my chair. The faint evening breeze drifted in, carrying the scent of grass and blooming flowers, mingling with the remnants of the wine in the room. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should follow him. But something pulled me forward, curiosity, concern, or perhaps the magnetic tension that had been building all weekend. I stepped out onto the patio, where Sebastian was leaning against the railing. The dim glow of the porch light illuminated his profile, casting sharp shadows across his face. His hands gripped the wooden rail tightly, knuckles white, as if he were holding on for dear life. "Sebastian?" I called softly, breaking the stillness. He didn't turn right away. Instead, he sighed deeply, his shoulders rising and falling before finally speaking. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible over the chirping of crickets. "For what?" I asked, stepping closer but keeping a careful distance. "For making things weird," he replied, finally turning to face me. His eyes searched mine, full of an emotion I couldn't quite place. "I don't know what's wrong with me. I feel like I'm losing control." I shook my head, trying to meet his vulnerability with reassurance. "You don't have to apologize, Sebastian. Whatever's going on, it's okay to feel it. You don't have to have all the answers right now." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's the thing. I think I do have the answer. I've had it for a while. I've just been too scared to admit it." I froze, his words hanging in the air between us like a live wire. There it was, the thing we'd both been dancing around all weekend, brought into the open. "What is it?" I asked cautiously, though part of me already knew. Sebastian looked down, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I think I've been pretending for so long that I don't even know what's real anymore. But being here with you, it feels real, and that terrifies me." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just a passing moment of confusion for him. It was something deeper, something that mirrored the feelings I'd been trying to suppress. "Sebastian," I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You don't have to be scared. Whatever this is, we can figure it out together." He looked up then, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Do you mean that?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I mean it." The air between us felt electric, charged with the weight of unspoken emotions and possibilities. And then, before I could fully process what was happening, he closed the distance between us. His lips brushed mine softly at first, a tentative question rather than a demand. It was a fleeting touch, but it sent a shockwave through me. When I didn't pull away, he deepened the kiss, his hands moving to my shoulders as if anchoring himself to me. For a moment, I let myself get lost in it. The warmth of his touch, the sheer intensity of the connection between us. But then reality crashed down like a wave, and I stepped back, breaking the kiss. "We can't do this," I said, my voice shaky. Sebastian looked at me, his expression a mix of confusion and hurt. "Why not? You said we could figure this out." "I know what I said," I replied, running a hand through my hair. "But this is complicated. You're Ethan's best friend. I'm his father. This changes everything." He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "I don't care about any of that. All I know is that being around you feels more right than anything has in a long time." I wanted to believe him, to let myself give in to whatever this was between us, but the weight of the situation was too much to ignore. "Sebastian, this isn't just about us," I said, my voice firm despite the ache in my chest. "We have to think about the consequences." He stared at me for a long moment before finally nodding, though the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. "I understand," he said quietly. "But that doesn't make this any easier." We stood there in silence, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. Eventually, Sebastian turned and walked back into the house, leaving me alone on the patio with my thoughts. As the night stretched on, I found myself replaying every moment, every word, every touch. I knew I'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. But the real question was, where would we go from here? The morning light filtered through the curtains as I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. The house felt heavier, the silence between us now palpable. Sebastian entered the room, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed the storm within. "Morning," he said, his voice hesitant. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone steady. We exchanged few words, the weight of the previous night hanging over us. When he finally gathered his things, ready to leave, he paused by the door. "I don't regret last night," he said, his voice firm, "but I'll respect your decision." I nodded, watching as he stepped out into the sunlight, leaving me alone with the echo of his words. Days turned into weeks, and life returned to its predictable rhythm. But the memory of Sebastian lingered. His words, his touch, his vulnerability. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd let something important slip through my fingers. One evening, as I sat alone, a message lit up my phone. It was from Sebastian. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. I'll never forget what you taught me about being honest with myself." I stared at the screen, the weight of my own words still unspoken. Taking a deep breath, I began typing a reply. Sometimes life throws us into unexpected situations that challenge who we are and what we want. Would you have made a different choice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that make you question, reflect, and feel.